So I'm going to be doing a live demo today. Again, please interrupt with questions as you have them. We'll just kind of go through the work that we're doing. So just to remind you of our 4 key feature areas, I won't go in a lot of detail for these, but core at all of this is sort of sample tracking, being able to customize your sample data as well as track them in the system, being able to store them, manage any workflow, sample processing on your samples in the lab, and then any assay data capture as well. So we'll see how that kind of transitioned. Great. So this is really sort of the standard sample manager dashboard. This again is our LabKey fake lab, so it's not real. You can pretty quickly see we're kind of a little bit sort of clinical, and then maybe like dabbling in some medical cannabis research as well. I have a lot of overdue work. I'm a very delinquent lab member, as you can see, but my primary focus is not necessarily on this. And then also any recent assay data that is uploaded into the system, I can sort of go interrogate and get excited about. Since this is sample manager, we're going to go into samples first. And somebody at some point had talked about different sample types and how to structure these. Again, all of these are names that we made up here. It made sense for us to have a blood sample type. You could have a tissue sample type, or a dirt or rocks, or whatever you want to capture here. But all of this was customized by us. This gives us an insight into the types of blood samples that we've got in the system. We have a little over 700. Most of our blood samples are being attached to mouse sources or study sources. And we also have that naming pattern that folks talked about. So really, anytime I don't provide a unique name in the system's going to give me a name that's effectively blood with a 5-digit number at the end of it. I can search and filter through, and Jess kind of had mentioned this in her talk as well, and start to see drill down on some of these samples. So maybe I'm like really interested in project X, and I only want tubes that were sort of normal in color when we receive them. And so that limits me now to 141 samples. We can kind of start to see we've got a little more built out data in our fake lab. We've got the barcodes here as well. If I drill into any given sample, I can start to see information about that sample in particular. So whether or not it's in storage, if there are any aliquots that are generated from it, and if there are they available? Any of that metadata or data around that sample that was captured in the grid, I can edit here if I wanted to as well. And then I can also see that context of the sample, of where did it come from? And in this case, we received it from lab 17, and it's part of study 25. I can also get a better sense of this context, both in where it originated from, but then what also came out of it in this lineage grid view. And we can see that I've got those 2 aliquots again. I have no other derivatives. I think everybody kind of showed a good example of what their lineage looks like. It's different for every team in the lab. I can find out more about the aliquots. I can start exporting. I can do things like add these aliquots to storage or go beyond that. If I had any assay data associated with this sample or workflow job data, that would get represented here. And you can see that I have this sample as part of my demo blood analysis, and we're a little overdue and probably need to get to work on that. So now I can go ask Bernie after this and say, hey, do you want to do this task that's been assigned to you? We also have the sample timeline, and this is actually a very short sample timeline of a sample since it's been registered in the system, but we can see information about the sample as we drill into it. So when the sample was registered, when it was updated, by whom, and then what the updates were. So we can see that Steve actually made these connections between the study in the lab of the sample in June, and then if it was added to any workflow jobs or assay data, if it had been in storage, we'd see those events as well. You can imagine using this tool in a real lab, this list gets very, very long, very quickly. And even though we don't obviously allow you to change anything in the audit log, we do allow you to sort of filter by event if you're very interested and like, I really just need to see, you know, what's happened in terms of storage. You would be able to select that and filter that down. So this becomes a little bit more manageable to read and understand. If I head back into sort of the blood grid, I have a lot of options here. And the first thing that I want to do is actually create some of my own samples and demonstrate that. So I'm going to choose to create some more blood samples. I could do this manually. I can add in one by one and row by row, and I could copy paste or just enter in as I wanted to. But I've actually just got a file that I have locally, maybe a manifest that I received from another group that I want to bring in. And so I'm just going to drag and drop this file. I can get a little preview, make sure that this is the right one. These are my LKUC samples, the LabKey user conference samples. So yep, this is the right one. I do want to import this, so I'm going to select those. I now have 17 new samples. In this case, I do want to add them to storage. And so maybe the first part of my work is registering the samples, which I've just demonstrated, and then adding them to storage. And so I'll select this option. I get provided the views of the different freezers that I have. In this case, I want to put my blood samples into the -80. At any given hierarchy here, if there's not enough space to put my 17 samples, I will get a notification that there won't be enough space. And so that could happen at the freezer level or at the shelf or the box level. But I see that I've got some room in blood box 3, so I'm going to select those. We automatically are going to start fulfilling all the spaces for you. And so you can see that this one blood sample is going to go into this empty A3 spot. And then I have the rest of the samples here to select as well. I'm just going to quickly put in all of the different volumes here. I could set all of these as milliliters, but the system already knows that my default unit for blood is in mils, so I'm going to leave it alone. I could also choose to update the freeze thaw count upon putting into storage for the first time. We used to receive a lot of frozen samples from labs, and so we wanted to make sure that we were accurately capturing that freeze thaw count. And so you do have sort of that override option to do here as well. I'll add these to the box, and you can see now I've got all of these blood samples are added. If I look into any given sample, we can see the information about it. I could go drill back into that sample, that same view that we were looking at. I can check samples out, check samples in, move them, do a variety of different actions from this grid view. In this case, I just want to check this one out. I get to comment on why I'm moving it. When it's checked out, we reserve this spot for you to put it back in the right place. And then I can check it back in. And when I check this sample back in, I get my auto decrementing feature. And so in this case, it's like I use 200 microliters of blood for my assay. And I do indeed want that freeze thaw count to be incremented. So I can check that in. We automatically do that calculation for you, and you get the freeze thaw count. And then it's all going to be part of that sample timeline history as well. And so we could take a look at that. Other things that you can do from this view is filter down on the the grid view of these samples. And this, I think, is what Anthony was kind of referring to, is you can start filtering, excuse me, and sorting along here and export either a manifest or a file that could actually provide some input value for instrumentation or other things as well. And so you could very easily just export this grid and like send this box out to your collaborators or to an associate if needed. Another really cool thing that I love about what we built here in freezer management is not only are we capturing the full audit log of the sample itself, but as any of you know, regardless of how you're keeping track of samples in your freezers, sometimes things go awry, right? Your physical storage isn't matching what you have tracked digitally or on paper or from your memory, whatever it is. And it then becomes very hard to resolve some of those differences of, was there ever meant to be a blood sample here? Like what's going on? And so for each of these, we actually have each spot in the freezer, we have a full location history. And so for this one, you can see the full history here is that we checked in a sample, we checked it out, or we added it, we checked it out and checked it back in. If I go to a different cell, we might see some different history. And so if we had moved samples and not move them within the system, we might be able to see like, oh, the last person who touched this was Hannah. Let me go back and check with her and see if she just forgot to mark a checkout in the freezer or something like that. We can also move full storage units. So in the case where your freezer goes down, you want to move everything maybe to your backup freezer. You would have the option to do that sort of at the box level or the shelf level or the rack level as well, and just sort of do a bulk move of all of these are going into that backup freezer. Again, all of that gets audited and tracked as well. In terms of storage in general, we do have sort of a storage home dashboard as well that gives me a quick overview of what is living in each of my freezers. And so we can see that we've collected a lot of blood samples that are stored in our -4 and -80. We've got a bunch of plasma samples in our liquid nitrogen, which scientifically is not maybe super accurate, but again, it's our LabKey lab, and science doesn't matter necessarily here, or accuracy of it. You can also see all of the number of samples that are checked out by users. And so this is where you can start to interrogate what samples might need to be checked in versus discarded versus, somebody overwhelmed in the lab and something's been sitting in the fridge for a while, you want to get it back in the freezer to maintain integrity. For each freezer that is created, administrators have the option, as I think Anthony showed in his talk, to configure the hierarchy however they want. So in this case, our -4 has 8 shelves, and within each of these shelves, there might be different numbers of boxes or the same, or you might have racks. I can also edit this as I'm going. So what we used to do in the lab, we would always have an empty shelf that would just allow for room for Mr. Frosties or things like that. And as we got busier and busier and our freezer started filling up, we would start to slowly sort of add more racks to that shelf. And so in this case, I would have the ability to go in and maybe take a look at my shelf number 8 and see, oh, we've got shelf 8, drawer 1, and then within that drawer, there's another shelf, and we've got a set of boxes here. And yeah, maybe that's the exact kind of shelf I want to make again. So I'm going to create another shelf 9. My spaces available then also starts to increase because I just added an entirely new shelf, and all of that again is customizable and flexible for me to do. We also have the ability to manage storage units. So in cases where you want to have boxes versus plates or 2 racks or bags, you're able to do that. And we allow you to have the flexibility of setting the number of columns and rows, as well as how those are displayed. So understanding that not every lab has the same nomenclature for boxes. And so we want to sort of acknowledge that and let you really track how people are referring to the box locations most accurately in the lab. So I'm not seeing any questions here so far. I'm just going to keep on rolling through, but feel free to ask any questions in the chat if you want to see something or if I've just gone over something quickly. Other options that we have, I'm going to go back to our blood samples. I'm going to take a look at my 17 new LabKey user conference samples that I've got. And now I want to add them to a workflow job. And so maybe this is part of it. Once they're in the freezer, I want to start doing blood analysis. And it looks like, is it possible to see where all the spaces are in a given freezer? And I'm assuming here you mean sort of the empty spaces. And the answer is not yet. We've definitely received this request a lot. And so we've been sort of mulling over how we want to do this, but there are sort of options as you're entering samples into the freezer to see where things are available and things like that. But I also have the ability to go into a certain storage unit and see, you know, where the capacity is. So I've got about 1,200 spaces available here. If I select a shelf, I can see that capacity at the shelf as well. So I can start drilling in and being like, oh, well, what about box 2? And I can see I've got 46 spaces available, but having that overall view for a given freezer, we don't have yet, but that is on our roadmap. Another question here, can you show connecting samples to demographic information? So yeah, absolutely. What I'll do is actually sort of connect my samples that I registered. So if I go into any of these samples, we can look at their lineage. They're not connected to anything. I just sort of imported them as is, but now I really want to make that connection to the sources that I have in the freezer. And so I'm going to edit the sources that I have for these samples. Maybe all of these blood samples came from the same place. So I'm going to say they came from a person, and maybe it's person 1. And I'm going to make that update here to that person. I can also go back in and take a look at sort of a subject-centric view here. So my source is set up again. I named it subjects. You can name it whatever you want. We've got a lot of creativity here on how people are wanting to group and collate their samples together. So really sort of the world's your oyster on this one. But traditionally, you know, we've got our source ID, we have some information about the subject, probably, you know, wouldn't want to really capture their date of birth here, but we get their enrollment date, primary language, things like that. If I drill into this subject as well, I get information about all of the samples that have been derived from this subject in the system. And so we can see that there are 21 blood samples and 13 PBMCs and plasma and DNA. And again, that gets represented on the lineage graph. And this one gets complicated because we have a lot of samples. And so maybe we want a grid view because maybe I need to send this out to somebody if these are all the samples that we've collected on this subject. And so that all gets represented here in these grids, and we can export, we can make changes here as needed as well. Mentioned barcodes, and Sample Manager does support scanning. Can scanning be used to advance workflow tasks automatically? So yeah, that's actually our ultimate hope, right? So if you were part of the product update, earlier, I mentioned this concept of automating workflow and having workflow really become more efficient and automated as people need it, right? Like Jess also mentioned, she loves sort of the non-automation of it. And so we want to provide people with those options. So that's definitely something that we're thinking about for next year. As you move samples through a workflow, you might be able to sort of update them through scanning or other automation methods as well. Okay, so I've added some samples, I added them to the freezer, I've even added some lineage around them. I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. You know, the next thing I want to do is I want to start adding them to a workflow job. So I'm going to go back to those blood samples. I could have done it from that other grid as well, but I'm going to do it here. I'm going to select these 17 samples, which are already selected, very handy for me. I'm going to create a new job. And so in this case, I can start a job with the selected samples, or I can add them to an existing job. I want to start a brand new job just so you guys see what this looks like. If you can sort of see this here, we've got some job details and information. This is a completely ad hoc task. So, or ad hoc job, which means I get to create all of the tasks that are associated with this job. I don't want to do that. I want to save time both in the lab, but then also for my demo. So I'm going to pick a template here where it makes more sense to do something. And so in this case, I may want to perform a bunch of analyses on the blood samples that I get. So I'm going to select that template. My tasks now automatically get filled out for me. So this is something where, again, you could translate your SOPs in the lab to workflow job templates that people can instantiate and run on samples. I can set a job name or let Sample Manager do it for me. I can also sort of start setting job owner. So maybe in this case, Adam is truly the job owner. They're his samples. He wants to be notified as work happens. We can also start to notify some users as well. And so we can select a variety of different people here and say, oh yeah, if you want to get emailed about this, just to know that stuff's going on. You don't have to do anything, but you'll be notified of what's happening. And then setting job start and due dates. And this really sort of allows people to understand the priority of work in the lab. And so maybe we want everything done tomorrow, and because it needs to be done tomorrow, I'm going to mark it as like high in terms of urgency. I could add attachments here. This could be SOPs, it could be templates that you want people to use, or other things that help provide information about this. And then I can go into the tasks, and I can see again sort of what work needs to be done, and I can make assignments. And so I'll just sort of assign Bernie some work here and be like, yeah, like Bernie really should be doing some of this, and then maybe I'll take over at some point as well. But this allows us to really have a task level assignment as well as due dates as needed. So I'm going to finish creating the job. We can see all of the information that I just did. As an administrator, I can just take some work from Bernie and start completing the tasks and say, oh yeah, we received those blood and check the tubes. Maybe we did aliquot them and everything was fine. And now I'm at my CBC assay data task. And so in this case, I want to do the assay, and then I actually want to upload the Before I complete this task, I'm going to import this data. And I have the option now, again, the CBC assay, something totally made up by me. And I can start filling out some information that we want to capture on this assay, like who the operator was, or what the instrument was that I ran it on, or what date it was run on. And capture that here. I could also add the raw data file, which some people are really interested in. Some people do this for microscopy as well. Or in some cases, they've asked about links to external ELNs too, and that's an option. Again, you have a lot of flexibility in how you want to add data here. You could upload a file, you could enter it directly into the grid. In this case, I've got a file maybe from my instrument that I want to upload. I get a little preview again. Yep, these are the right sample IDs that I want to be uploading. Once I import that, I can kind of look at the data that I have, make sure that that's right. And then I'm going to go back to that workflow task and complete it. And then I could just keep going on, right? We have the option to complete this task, or I'm just going to leave it kind of hanging right now. I'm not seeing more questions. Oh, I am. Oh, there are more questions coming. So yeah, there's Another person asked if a sample can exist in the system without being stored in the freezer. And the answer is absolutely. And that's kind of what we showed at the very beginning of when a sample had not been added to a freezer, it still showed up in this grid. We actually have the option to filter through and only look for samples that are stored in the freezer or not stored in the freezer. So in this case, maybe I'm looking for all my blood samples that are not in storage, and we get a grid. We've got 367. And so this might be because they are consumed, which the sample status coming out in about a month will show, or if maybe they've never made it to the freezer because we consume them right away, or they're registered, but we haven't received them into the lab yet. Why are there so few medical cannabis samples? Well, I think somebody just created this in our fake LabKey lab. And so you really have the option to create as many samples as you need to accurately reflect the science that you're doing in your lab. And is it possible to edit workflow jobs and templates? And the answer is mostly yes. So if we go back in and try and edit the work that I was doing in the lab, and I don't know if this is the right one, but we can definitely take a look at it. At this point, I'm not able to sort of make edits to the job, but if I were to instantiate an ad hoc job or create a job from a template and then make changes in advance of like that, we have this standard template, but I want to alter it a little bit in what I'm going to do. It's really meant to be sort of that premeditated work that you're doing in the lab. Is there a size limitation to the file if we decide we want to load raw data files for a sample? Sequencing data, for example, was mentioned. Yeah, so I don't know the size limitation offhand, but generally best practice for bigger files is we would create a link out to that. I think we could easily have a link with sort of our LabKey server product that we talked about. Adam had mentioned that we have a lot of integration with S3. So typically you want to sort of handle those larger files in a different place anyways. And so that would be my recommendation, although we would certainly work with you to try and get it, if you wanted it directly here in this system, how we could help support that. Okay. So the last thing I want to show before we sort of round out here is, again, looking at this assay data. So we saw the assay data in the context of a workflow job, but we also have the option to look at the assay data sort of standalone and do analytics and reporting on that as well. So we get this concept of the number of experiments that I've done, the CBC runs that I've done. We've got about 32 here. Again, I've got a bunch of information on these. I can look at each individual run and sort of analyze those as I want to, but I could also look at all of the results across runs. And this would allow me to make sort of generalizations or quality control and decide that we want to do maybe more with those samples as well. So again, on any given grid, I can start filtering, and what I'm really looking for white blood cell count that is sort of less than maybe we'll say 1,000 here. We get a very limited number of samples that we have. I could export this and be like, hey, we want to double check these. Like this is, it's uncharacteristic, obviously, for groups to have folks to have that few. So we might want to track it and see what's going on there. And then another question here, can the non-text files other than text format be uploaded? So I think you're referring to the sort of import of sample data or source data or assay data. And the answer is yes. So we support .txt and Excel and TSV as well. If you're referring to sort of the file that's being represented here, this is really agnostic to the type of file. It's, we've just allowed for you to say, yep, you want to add a file and make that change. Okay. So without any other questions, I'm going to head back into the presentation here. And some of you might be wondering now how you might get Sample Manager. So if you are new to LabKey or if you're a current Community Edition user, you can purchase Sample Manager as a standalone product. And this is something both that Andy and Jess are using, and they showed you today. And that's really sort of the very low touch, low implementation, easy to use method of getting started. You can also upgrade to a LabKey Premium Edition. So if you are a Community Edition and really are enjoying the features that we have as part of LabKey Server and just want to add Sample Manager, as sort of Anthony and Smiley had talked about, you could do that. Or if maybe you're just interested in learning more, you can take a tour of Sample Manager and send that over to folks and ask them to take a tour or request a demo, likely with me, maybe with Jason or Steve or others at LabKey. But I love doing them. They're always really fun. We like to put it in as much sort of context as you need, and we go from there. So with that, just a little bit over time again, we have probably a little bit of time for questions, but I'm fairly certain I answered most of your questions as I went. I'm seeing one here about how Sample Manager integrates with LabKey Study. So if you entered a new sample in Sample Manager, would it show up in Study or vice versa? And the answer is yes, it can. And we do have mechanisms to provide for that. And we work with groups to get that in. I think Anthony had kind of mentioned that. In his case, it wasn't necessarily subjects in a study, but sort of the kit IDs that they were tracking and wanted to enter into the system. So certainly that's possible. And that's sort of the integration that we worked on this year and will continue to work on next year as well.